I never thought the end of the world would come like this. Not with sirens blaring, not with tanks rolling down city streets, but quietly, in the form of the dead. The news said virus, then infection, then chaos. By the time the reports stopped coming, it was too late. People didn't just die, they changed. Eyes went vacant, skin pale and cold. They shuffled, they bit, they killed. And the world I knew, the one with coffee shops, noisy traffic, and late-night laughter, vanished. I survived because I'd bought a small island home on a whim years ago. A tiny, stubborn structure with a weathered red roof and a single dock jutting into endless water. It had a kitchen, a bedroom, and a stubbornly creaky floor that moaned under every step. Out here, surrounded by water, the dead couldn't reach me. At least, that's what I told myself every night as I listened to the wind sweep across the surface, lapping against the rocks like a lullaby. The first few days were almost peaceful. I rationed the canned goods I'd been too lazy to rotate through in my pantry, fished from the little wooden rowboat tied to the dock, and kept my small generator humming so I had lights at night. The water was my shield. I could see the mainland in the distance, a faint haze of gray and burnt orange where smoke still lingered from burning towns. Every so often, a silhouette of a drowned tree or the skeletal shell of a car would bob in the currents. I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to see the world beyond my watery moat. The first sign of danger was almost comical. I was fishing at dawn, the oars slicing gently through misty water, when I heard a splash. Not the soft plunk of a fish, but the heavy, unsteady fall of something large. My heart jumped as I turned toward the sound. Floating near the surface was a body, half submerged, hair clinging wet to the face, arms flailing uselessly. At first, I thought it was someone alive, someone who had survived like me, struggling in the water. But the eyes, oh God, the eyes, that vacant stare, as if life had fled and left only hunger behind. I paddled back to the dock as quickly as I dared, slipping silently under the shadow of the morning fog. My heart pounded so hard it echoed in my chest. The body drifted with the current, just out of reach. I couldn't leave it there. I also couldn't risk it reaching me. I grabbed the boat hook and nudged the corpse out of the water, dragging it onto the rocks. My stomach churned, bile rising as I took in the grotesque clarity. Lips torn, skin peeled in places, a grotesque reminder of what the world had become. I burned it. The fire was small, contained, and I stared at the blackening remnants until the smell of smoke and ash replaced the metallic tang of death. Even so, sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of the house, every ripple against the shore, felt like a threat. I kept my axe beside the bed, the old one my father had given me, feeling its weight a comfort against the uncertainty outside. Food became my obsession. The island had some wild berries, but nothing substantial. I relied on fishing, learning patterns, watching the tides, and trying not to think about the things I might pull up. Some mornings I found nothing. Other days, the water gifted me a wriggling, silver trout or a soft, writhing crab. I kept a careful tally, rationing so that nothing would spoil before I ate it. I even began setting traps along the shoreline, small nets tied to wooden stakes for crabs or eels. Loneliness was my second enemy. I spoke to myself often, muttering the day's events aloud, reciting songs I half remembered from long drives before the world ended. I named the seagulls Roger, for the one that always perched on the dock, and Beatrice, who seemed too curious for her own good. I knew it was ridiculous. I knew that talking to birds wasn't survival. But the nights were long, and the silence on the island was oppressive. Then the storm came. Not a mere rainstorm, but a violent, screaming tempest that turned my little island into a place of chaos. Rain pelted the roof, waves crashed against the dock, and wind threatened to snap the old wooden frame in two. I secured the boat, tied every loose plank and shutter, and watched from the small kitchen window as the horizon disappeared in a gray haze. I realized that out here, even the water wasn't entirely safe. A storm could capsize my boat, sweep supplies away, or even drown me in sleep-deprived exhaustion. I huddled in bed, axe in hand, listening to the fury outside. Morning revealed the aftermath. Debris floated in the water twigs, branches, pieces of plastic, and my dock had shifted slightly on its pilings. The storm hadn't destroyed me, but it had reminded me that isolation wasn't a guarantee of safety. The zombies couldn't reach me, but nature still could. Hunger, exhaustion, and the gnawing unease of solitude were constant threats. I realized then that survival was more than staying alive. It was understanding the rhythm of this new world. Water was protection, yes, but it was also a boundary. I had to explore, gather, and know the limits of my little fortress. So I repaired the dock, patched the boat, and marked the shoreline with notches in the rocks, a crude map for myself. Each day became a ritual: fishing, gathering, maintaining, and keeping watch. But despite all precautions, I sensed the change coming. The isolation that once felt like sanctuary now felt like a cage. Something had begun to stir beyond the water's edge, a subtle movement I couldn't explain. Shadows on the horizon, perhaps, or ripples in the wrong place at the wrong time. Whatever it was, I couldn't ignore it. The world might have ended, but it wasn't done testing me yet. After the storm, I couldn't stay cooped up any longer. The waves had left me a gift of sorts: driftwood, bits of rope, and a couple of empty crates that might serve as extra storage. I untied the boat at dawn, feeling the chill bite at my hands, and pushed off into the misty morning. The water was calm now, like glass reflecting the pale sky, and for a brief moment, I almost believed the world was at peace. Almost. Fishing had become second nature, but today I had another purpose. I needed to explore. I had scouted the horizon before, but fog had always limited my view, leaving only vague shapes and shadows. I rowed slowly, keeping the island behind me in sight, the red roof a stubborn dot against the gray. My oars cut the water with quiet precision. I let my mind wander, planning routes, imagining the possibilities, weighing risks. I spotted a small inlet on the eastern side of the island, a narrow channel partially hidden by reeds. Something about it called to me. Perhaps it was the hope of finding untouched fish, or the curiosity that had survived longer than caution. I nudged the boat forward, careful not to disturb the water too much. The reeds whispered as I passed through, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move beneath the surface. I froze, heart hammering. My first thought, a large fish. My second thought, a drowned body. But as I peered over the edge, nothing surfaced. Only water, dark and swirling, hiding secrets I wasn't meant to know yet. I shook my head, scolding myself for letting fear creep in, and focused on fishing. Hours passed. I caught 2 trout and a crab, enough to supplement my dwindling canned supplies. I rowed slowly back, keeping a vigilant eye on the horizon. That's when I noticed something odd. Floating on the water, just beyond the inlet, were shapes, not the usual driftwood or debris. They were moving. I held my breath. Zombies didn't swim, at least not well. They could float, they could drift with currents, but they were terrible in water. Yet there they were, half submerged, bodies bobbing as if testing the limits of buoyancy. One drifted closer to the shore, its pale arm breaking the surface. My stomach turned. I had thought myself safe, untouchable here. But the sight reminded me that the dead were patient. They could wait, they could drift, and sometimes they could come closer than I expected. I rowed faster, heart thudding in my chest. Reaching the dock, I tied the boat and bolted into the house, locking the door behind me. I counted my weapons: the axe, a small hunting knife, and a baseball bat leaning against the wall. Not much, but enough for now. I knew I'd have to stay vigilant. That night, sleep came in short bursts, haunted by images of pale faces bobbing in the water. I dreamed of reaching the mainland, only to find streets filled with the dead, silent and unyielding. I woke with a start, chest heaving, and I knew something had to change. Survival wasn't just about rationing food or avoiding the mainland. I had to understand the water itself, the currents, the tides, the way it could bring the dead closer or sweep them away. The next morning, I crafted a simple watchtower, a wooden scaffold from driftwood, and the remnants of a broken crate perched near the highest point of the island. From there, I could see further, scan the horizon for movement, and track changes in the tides. I named it the Lookout, and it became my first defense mechanism beyond the water itself. Days turned into a routine. Fish, trap, maintain, observe. But even in the routine, something shifted. I began to notice subtle signs, ripples where nothing should be. The occasional scream carried faintly across the water, though sometimes I wondered if it was just my imagination, and shadows moving in ways they shouldn't. Isolation had sharpened my senses, but it had also made me paranoid. Every small disturbance felt like an omen, a warning. Then, I discovered the first real surprise: signs of life beyond my island. At first, I thought it was impossible. Out here, no one should be alive. And yet, one morning, I spotted smoke rising from a distant tree line across the water. Not black, not like a firestorm, but thin, curling gray smoke. Someone had made a fire. Someone was out there. I didn't know whether to feel hope or dread. Hope because life existed, perhaps even companionship. Dread because life meant unpredictability, and unpredictability could kill. I spent the day observing, using a small pair of binoculars I had salvaged from the house. I couldn't see anyone clearly, but I could see movement. Quick, purposeful steps, a shadow slipping behind trees. My mind raced. Were they survivors or something worse? Could they be hostile? Or were they infected? By evening, I had made a decision. Tomorrow, I would take the boat and explore. I would see for myself what or who was out there. I knew the risks, but staying isolated forever was no longer an option. The island was safe, yes, but it was also lonely, predictable, and, in the long term, unsustainable. I had to understand the world beyond the water. That night, I packed supplies: canned food, water, the hunting knife, a small flare gun I had found in the storm debris, and a rope. I checked the boat twice, patched a small leak with a strip of tarp, and made a mental plan for escape if needed. I couldn't predict what I'd find, but I could prepare to survive it. Sleep came, fitful and shallow, but it brought clarity. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was hunting knowledge, and whatever or whoever was out there, I would face it. Dawn came gray and quiet, the fog hanging low over the water. I untied the boat and slipped into the channel, each paddle stroke deliberate and silent. My stomach twisted with a mix of excitement and fear. Out there, past the edge of the island, the unknown awaited. The smoke from yesterday was faint now, but I could still see its curl against the horizon. I aimed the boat in that direction, moving cautiously, aware of how exposed I was. The water reflected the muted sky, And for every ripple that wasn't my own, my heart leapt. I kept my hands on the paddle, my eyes scanning constantly. Hours passed. The shoreline grew closer, the trees jagged and blackened in some places, the remains of humanity's neglect. I passed a half-sunken dock. One side snapped off like a broken tooth. Small fish darted beneath the surface, oblivious to the danger above. For the first time since the outbreak, I felt small, insignificant in the scale of this changed world. My island felt like a fortress, but out here, I was just another fragile creature on the surface. Then I saw them, 3 figures moving along the shoreline. At first, I thought they were zombies. Something about the way they shuffled, uneven steps, heads tilted too far forward. But as I squinted, I realized their movement was purposeful, careful. They weren't walking to stumble or wander. They were stalking, scanning the water, aware of me long before I'd noticed them. I froze. My heart raced, my chest tight. They carried tools or weapons. I couldn't tell which. And they weren't alone. Behind them, a 4th figure lagged, more hesitant, looking around nervously. My instinct screamed at me, "Hide! Retreat! Go back!" But curiosity, that reckless curiosity, pushed me forward. I paddled closer, keeping low in the boat, blending as much as I could with the morning mist. The figures stopped at the edge of the water, looking toward the opposite shore. One of them raised an arm, signaling the others. I could see now that they weren't zombies. The person's movements were deliberate, human, calculating. And then the one in front turned toward me. I froze. Their face was partially obscured by a hood, but the eyes, sharp, calculating, alive, locked on mine. I wanted to call out, to wave, but my voice stuck. I realized, in that moment, how vulnerable I was. The water that had protected me, the isolation that had been my shield, meant nothing here. I was an open target. One of them, probably the leader, lifted a hand, pointing a weapon at me. My mind raced. I had no idea if they wanted to kill me, rob me, or bring me help. Every scenario ended badly, and yet I couldn't turn away. I gripped my paddle, ready to fight or flee, my heart hammering like a drum. They didn't fire. Instead, the figure lowered the weapon slightly, nodding toward the island. I took the cue, raising one hand in a cautious wave. After a tense pause, the figures stepped back, disappearing behind the trees. My chest heaved, relief and fear tangled together. They hadn't attacked, but they hadn't left either. I returned to the island that day, nerves frayed. My safe haven felt smaller now, vulnerable. I secured the perimeter, checked the dock, and double-locked the doors. My mind churned with questions. Who were they? Were they alone? Were they dangerous? And more importantly, had they noticed my island? For days, I watched. From the lookout, I scanned the distant shore, but the smoke had vanished. The figures didn't return. Maybe they had moved on, or maybe they were waiting, watching. The ambiguity gnawed at me more than any actual attack could. Food became harder to catch, as if the water knew my attention was divided. I spent hours fishing, only to find my traps empty, my lines snapping. Each failure felt like a reminder. Survival was never guaranteed. Even isolation, even water, could not make me untouchable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw a small boat drifting toward the island. My heart jumped. The silhouette of a lone figure, paddling with methodical strokes, heading straight for me. I ran to the dock, gripping the axe, ready for anything. The figure approached, slowing as they neared the shore. Then, in a calm voice, they called out, "Hello? I mean no harm." I froze. The voice was human, familiar, almost comforting in its tone. I lowered the axe slightly, keeping it ready. They reached the dock and climbed out, keeping their distance. "I'm looking for survivors," they said, glancing around the island. "I've seen smoke here before. I didn't think anyone was still alive." I wanted to ask 1,000 questions at once, but my throat was dry, words stuck. Finally, I managed, "Who are you?" "Name's Mara," she said, keeping her hands visible. "I've been traveling along the coast, avoiding things. The dead, the others. I saw your smoke last week and hoped someone was here." Hope. The word lodged in my chest. I hadn't realized how desperate I'd become for it. I didn't know if I could trust her, if she was dangerous, if she would bring more problems than she solved. But I also couldn't ignore the flicker of connection. I nodded slowly. "You can stay, for now. But I warn you, I don't take kindly to strangers who aren't careful." Mara smiled faintly. I wouldn't ask otherwise. That night, we ate fish over a small fire on the shore. Conversation was minimal at first. Me, suspicious. Her, cautious, but slowly, I learned bits of her story. She had survived by moving constantly, avoiding towns and other survivors who weren't friendly. She had seen horrors, as I had, and she understood fear and isolation. For the first time since the outbreak, I didn't feel completely alone. But as the moon rose over the water, silver and cold, I realized something chilling. Companionship brought hope, yes, but it also brought risk. Mara might be friendly, but the dead were still out there. And now, someone else knew where I lived. The island felt smaller again, but not in the same way. It wasn't just water that protected me anymore. It was knowledge, preparation, and, now, trust fragile and tentative. And I knew, deep down, that the world was about to test me in ways I hadn't yet imagined. The next morning, the water looked deceptively calm, stretching silver and glassy beneath the early sun. Mara and I worked side by side, repairing the dock and patching the boat, our movements synchronized in a rhythm neither of us had thought we'd find with another living soul. I watched her as she worked, deliberate, careful, quiet, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping at the edges of my mind. Trust was a fragile thing. I'd survived alone for weeks, months even, counting on my instincts, my routines. Mara disrupted that. Not in a bad way. She was useful, resourceful, but presence was a luxury the island hadn't needed before. And luxuries, I knew, could be deadly. By mid-afternoon, I decided it was time to explore the northern tip of the island. Mara followed without hesitation, carrying the small flare gun and a knapsack filled with supplies. As we rounded the rocks, the water deepened, dark and cold, reflecting a sky streaked with gray clouds. I paused, gripping the axe, the old familiar weight a comfort in my hands. "That side of the island's tricky," I warned her. "Currents are stronger, rocks sharper. I almost capsized last week." "I've paddled worse," she replied, eyes scanning the horizon. There was confidence in her voice, but I caught a flicker of caution too. Survival had hardened her, but not completely. We walked along the shoreline, the sand damp beneath our boots. That's when we saw them. At first, I thought it was driftwood, a pile of pale shapes half buried in the sand. But then I noticed movement, a subtle, jerky twitching. My stomach dropped. Zombies. They were clustered near a small cove, a handful of them, faces obscured by seaweed and salt, bodies mottled with decay. One lifted a hand, fingers curled, and let out a low, wet groan that made the hairs on my arms rise. "Stay back," I whispered, stepping in front of Mara. My axe felt heavier than ever, a lifeline and a weapon. She nodded, gripping the flare gun. I scanned the shoreline, calculating. The water wasn't deep enough to swim safely. The rocks were slippery, and the cove curved, creating a bottleneck that would force us into the open. We had no choice. We had to move. I took a deep breath, counting each step before we advanced. Mara followed my lead, silent except for the occasional whisper. The zombies' groans grew louder, more insistent, as if they sensed the vibration of our footsteps. I felt my pulse spike, every instinct screaming at me to run. One of them lunged. Its foot snagged on a jagged rock, sending it toppling into the shallow water with a splash. I swung the axe instinctively, connecting with a sickening crunch. Mara fired the flare gun, the bright light startling the others and giving us a moment to duck behind a boulder. "Move!" I hissed, and we sprinted along the narrow strip of sand, the groans and splashes behind us. One zombie reached the water's edge, its hand skimming our heels. I felt the cold spray on my face as we leapt onto the rocks, scrambling upward. My arms ached, my lungs burned, but adrenaline carried us. We reached the top of the cliff, overlooking the northern shore. Gasping, soaked, hearts pounding, Mara sank to a boulder, hands trembling as she caught her breath. That was close. "You think I don't know?" I growled, chest heaving. "We can't take chances like that again. Not here." We spent the next hour fortifying the northern edge of the island, dragging driftwood to create barricades, sharpening sticks as makeshift spikes, anything to slow the dead if they tried to reach the shore. For the first time, I realized water wasn't enough. Isolation might buy time, but it wouldn't guarantee safety. Zombies could drift, wash ashore, and if they learned to follow, they could corner us. That night, we ate in silence, the fire crackling between us. Mara washed the blood from her hands, careful to avoid the water, and I double-checked the locks on the house. My mind wouldn't stop racing. "I've seen groups like them," Mara said quietly, breaking the silence. "Small clusters. They're predictable, slow but persistent. If you ignore them, they'll eventually reach land or find a weak point. You can't fight them all." I nodded grimly. She was right. The island was safe, but it was not invincible. And for the first time, I realized my solitude had been a shield, but not a solution. I needed strategy, vigilance, and now a partner I could depend on. Sleep came fitful, interrupted by nightmares of zombies drifting through the water, circling the island, dragging themselves closer. I woke sweating. The fire burned low, Mara beside me, eyes open, alert. "It's coming," she whispered, though neither of us knew if she meant the dead or the inevitable test of trust between us. I held my axe, staring into the dark water beyond the dock. This island was home. It was my fortress. But now, I understood that survival wasn't about isolation. Survival was about adaptation, preparation, and the choices we made in the face of things that no one alive had ever faced before. And the choices were only just beginning. The next morning, the sun was pale and weak, barely breaking through low clouds. The northern barricade had held, but the groans from the previous day lingered in my ears, a constant reminder that the dead weren't going anywhere. Mara and I moved quickly, checking traps, mending the dock, and stocking supplies for what we both knew might be a risky excursion. We had to leave the island. The fish weren't enough anymore, and I suspected the small grove of wild berries near the northern tip was nearly depleted. I pointed to a distant shape, a rocky outcrop visible past the mist. "There's a small island about 2 miles east," I said. "Looks uninhabited. We could find food, maybe even fresh water." Mara nodded. "I've been moving along the coast for months. Islands like that often hold abandoned supplies. sometimes entire cabins or sheds left behind. But we have to be careful. Currents shift fast, and if zombies are drifting, they could be anywhere. We loaded the boat with a small pack each: canned food, a few tools, knives, a flare gun, rope, and our weapons. I ran my hand over the axe's worn handle, a silent reassurance. The water was eerily still as we pushed off. No wind, no waves, just the subtle ripple of oars, disturbing the mirror-like surface. For the first hour, we moved in near silence, listening only to the slap of water against the boat and the occasional cry of a distant gull. Then I saw movement. In the water, half submerged, drifting closer. Not just one, but a cluster of bodies, pale and bloated, arms flailing occasionally. I froze, heart hammering. Mara's hand found mine on the paddle. "They're coming with the current," she whispered. "Row faster. Don't draw attention." I obeyed instinctively, every stroke urgent, muscles burning. The bodies bobbed closer, groaning weakly, but the current carried them past us. We weren't safe, but for now, we had a small margin. I exhaled, sharply. Relief, mixed with tension. The small island came into view. Jagged rocks, a thin line of sandy beach, and a grove of trees that looked as though it had never been touched. We landed carefully, dragging the boat onto the shore. Mara scanned the tree line. No movement. We're alone for now. We set up a small perimeter, using driftwood and rocks to create rudimentary barricades. Then we began exploring. The island was small, but promising. Wild berries, a few shrubs, and a hidden freshwater spring trickled from a cleft in the rocks. I crouched by the spring, cupping the water to my lips. Cold, clean, life-saving. "This could keep us going for weeks," I said, looking at Mara. Her eyes reflected the same relief I felt. But the reprieve was brief. As we gathered what supplies we could, we heard it. A low groan. Faint, but unmistakable. I froze, eyes scanning the shadows. Mara moved silently beside me, flare gun raised. From the tree line, a single zombie emerged, staggering slowly, its gaze fixed on us. I swung the axe. Mara fired the flare, and the light made the figure hesitate. It wasn't fast, zombies never were, but the combination of fire and steel kept it at bay. Another groan answered, this one closer. We realized, with sinking hearts, that we weren't alone. A small group had followed the currents, drifting from somewhere else, and they were gathering. We retreated to the boat, grabbing what we could. The zombies shuffled closer, and I realized we'd have to make a choice: fight here or flee. The oars became weapons as much as instruments of escape. Mara paddled. I swung the axe at any approaching hands that reached the sides of the boat. The water splashed crimson around us, a reminder that death followed us, even here. We didn't stop until the island was a pale outline behind us. The zombies left struggling on the shore. My arms ached, the adrenaline beginning to fade, but my mind was sharper than ever. This world demanded constant vigilance. We could not afford to underestimate the dead or the currents that carried them. By the time we returned to our island, dusk was settling. The northern barricade had held again. But the island no longer felt as secure. The water had become both our shield and a pathway for danger. I realized that the longer we survived, the more we had to consider expansion, watchtowers, escape plans, even alliances. Mara and I ate in tense silence, knowing that the undead weren't the only threat. Our presence might attract the living as well, and not all survivors were friendly. That night, sleep was shallow. I dreamed of drifting bodies, of currents bringing the dead closer with every tide. I woke before dawn, staring at the water, knowing that tomorrow would bring more challenges, Survival was no longer just a matter of fishing, rationing, and isolation. It was about strategy, vigilance, and the courage to face threats that came from both the dead and the living. The island had been safe, the water had been protection. But now, with the dead drifting closer and Mara beside me, I understood the truth. Survival was a game of constant motion, adaptation, and trust, and the first real test was coming. The morning came heavy and gray, a thick fog rolling over the water like a curtain. I climbed to the lookout, Mara beside me, scanning the horizon. The sea was deceptively calm, but the currents betrayed small disturbances, ripples that didn't belong, faint shadows moving just beneath the surface. "They're back," I said quietly, my voice almost lost in the mist. Mara didn't respond immediately. She followed my gaze, eyes narrowing. Not just one this time, more than yesterday. I gritted my teeth. The northern barricade would only hold for so long, and the zombies weren't stopping. They were learning, adapting, testing our defenses. We couldn't wait for them to come. We had to be proactive. We spent the day preparing. Mara and I reinforced the dock with additional planks, sharpened stakes for the northern edge, and created a simple warning system using cans and rope, anything that would rattle if a zombie reached the shore. Every detail mattered. Survival had become a calculation of risk, timing, and instinct. By late afternoon, the groaning began. A low, unsettling chorus rising from the water, growing louder with every passing minute. I grabbed the axe, Mara the flare gun, and we waited. The first body emerged from the surf, bloated and pale, dragging itself toward the rocks. I swung the axe, connecting with a sickening crunch. Mara fired the flare, the bright red light illuminating the nightmare in vivid color. 2 more figures appeared, following the first, drawn by movement, by sound, by the faint scent of life. We fought fiercely, each strike precise. The barricade slowed them but didn't stop them. One staggered past a spike, reaching the dock. I swung again, heart pounding, sweat mixing with blood on my hands. Mara fired flares at intervals, warning us when the group tried to flank. The battle was brutal, chaotic, and relentless. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning. Finally, silence. The last groan echoed into the water, leaving only the rhythmic lapping of the waves. We stood, heaving, soaked in sweat and blood, surveying the aftermath. A few bodies lay strewn along the northern edge, defeated but not obliterated. More would come with the next tide. The dead didn't quit. Mara turned to me, eyes wide. "We can't stay here forever," she said, voice shaking. "They'll keep coming. And if we run out of food or weapons..." I nodded grimly. I knew she was right. Isolation had once been protection. Now, it was a prison. We had to expand, to fortify, to understand the patterns of the dead, and perhaps to seek allies, or at least knowledge of the mainland. That night, we ate in tense silence, cleaning our weapons and nursing small wounds. Every noise outside the house made us flinch. Sleep came fitful, interrupted by nightmares of the dead rising from every wave, every shadow, every reflection. By morning, I knew what had to be done. The island alone wouldn't guarantee survival. We would need to explore the coast, gather supplies, and learn more about the currents that brought the dead close. Mara agreed. Together, we packed the boat for a longer journey, preparing for the possibility that we might encounter other survivors or worse, entire hordes. As we pushed off, the water seemed calmer than it was, deceptive and false. The northern island receded behind us, a pale silhouette, and the mainland stretched faintly on the horizon. Every stroke of the oars felt heavier than before, weighted with the knowledge that our isolation was ending. We reached the first point of the mainland late in the afternoon. The shoreline was littered with debris, abandoned boats, broken trees, remnants of homes, and docks. No living humans in sight, only the occasional groan carried faintly on the wind. The currents here were treacherous, hiding rocks and submerged wreckage that could easily capsize the boat. I stepped onto the sand carefully, Mara close behind. The air smelled faintly of salt and rot, a reminder that even here, death lingered. We began searching, careful to avoid leaving tracks or making noise that could attract attention. It was then that we saw the first sign of others not dead. A small camp, abandoned in haste. A fire pit still smoldered, a few supplies scattered, but no people. Signs of struggle were everywhere. Footprints in the sand, splintered wood, scraps of clothing torn and abandoned. They were here recently, Mara said, her voice low. Someone lived here, and they left fast. The night before the attack, the island was quiet, too quiet. Mara and I sat on the dock, the water glassy under the moonlight, each of us lost in thought. The previous day's excursions to the mainland had yielded some food and supplies, but they had also made us realize a truth I had been avoiding. The island was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap, a beacon for anything drawn to the smell of life. "We can't keep running," Mara said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the tension beneath it. "The dead are coming in greater numbers, and if there are other humans, we have no idea what we're walking into." I nodded, gripping my axe. "Then we prepare. Every line, every barricade, every spike in place. Tonight, we hold the island, or we die trying." By dusk, we had fortified every vulnerable point. The northern edge was bristling with sharpened stakes. The dock had makeshift barricades, small alarms, drifting cans, and ropes hung from trees around the perimeter. Mara had rigged a series of flares at intervals, which could be fired to disorient approaching threats. We were ready, or as ready as two people could be, against the unrelenting dead. And then the groans began. At first, faint, almost distant, then closer, insistent. I climbed to the lookout, while Mara patrolled the northern shore, eyes straining through the fog. The water began to boil with movement, dozens of pale bodies drifting on the tide, some climbing onto rocks, testing our defenses. I swung the axe at the first that made it to the dock, Mara firing flares and wielding a knife with deadly precision. They came relentlessly, but we had prepared, and every strike, every shot, bought us a few precious seconds. Hours passed in a blur of blood, sweat, and fear. Each wave brought more, each groan a reminder of mortality. But then, something worse, a shout from the mainland. Human voices, loud and unrestrained. Mara's eyes widened. "Other survivors," she said grimly. "Or bandits. Either way, they're coming too." The night before the attack, the island was quiet, too quiet. Mara and I sat on the dock, the water glassy under the moonlight, each of us lost in thought. The previous day's excursions to the mainland had yielded some food and supplies, but they had also made us realize a truth I had been avoiding. The island was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap, a beacon for anything drawn to the smell of life. "We can't keep running," Mara said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the tension beneath it. "The dead are coming in greater numbers, and if there are other humans, we have no idea what we're walking into." I nodded, gripping my axe. "Then we prepare. Every line, every barricade, every spike in place. Tonight, we hold the island, or we die trying." By dusk, we had fortified every vulnerable point. The northern edge was bristling with sharpened stakes. The dock had makeshift barricades, small alarms, drifting cans, and ropes hung from trees around the perimeter. Mara had rigged a series of flares at intervals, which could be fired to disorient approaching threats. We were ready, or as ready as two people could be, against the unrelenting dead. And then the groans began. At first, faint, almost distant, then closer, insistent. I climbed to the lookout, while Mara patrolled the northern shore, eyes straining through the fog. The water began to boil with movement, dozens of pale bodies drifting on the tide, some climbing onto rocks, testing our defenses. I swung the axe at the first that made it to the dock, Mara firing flares and wielding a knife with deadly precision. They came relentlessly, but we had prepared, and every strike, every shot, bought us a few precious seconds. Hours passed in a blur of blood, sweat, and fear. Each wave brought more, each groan a reminder of mortality. But then, something worse, a shout from the mainland. Human voices, loud and unrestrained. By dawn, the fog lifted, revealing not only the lingering dead at the water's edge, but a small group of armed humans advancing along the beach. They were desperate, ragged, eyes wild. I realized instantly that our isolation had made us predictable. The island had offered safety, but now we had to defend it not just from the dead, but from the living. Mara and I retreated to the northern barricade, firing flares and swinging weapons with calculated precision. We picked off the first humans who came too close, forcing the rest to hesitate. The tide of the dead seemed to slow, as if sensing the tension among the living intruders. Hours passed, strategy and survival merging into instinct. We used the high ground, traps, and the currents to our advantage. Bodies both dead and living fell back into the water or retreated, giving us the upper hand. Exhaustion clawed at our limbs, but we had to continue. Every misstep could mean death. Finally, as the sun rose high and the tide retreated, the last of the attackers, both undead and human, were driven off or destroyed. Mara collapsed against the barricade, hands shaking. I lowered the axe, staring at the water, counting the cost. The island was quiet again. But for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: relief. Survival wasn't guaranteed, but we had survived, together. Mara looked at me, eyes tired but bright. "We made it," she said softly. I nodded, finally allowing myself a small smile. For now. But the world isn't done. It never is. We spent the next days repairing, fortifying, and preparing for the future. The island was still small, isolated, and surrounded by water. But now, it was more than a refuge. It was a home, a fortress, and a symbol of resilience. The dead would drift closer, storms would come, and humans might test us again, but we were ready. Together, we had faced the tide, the dead, and the living, and we had survived. And as I stood on the dock, looking at the water stretching endlessly into the horizon, I realized that survival wasn't just about avoiding death. It was about finding purpose, forming bonds, and standing against a world that had gone mad. The island would protect us for now, and as long as we were here, alive and vigilant, there was hope. The tide lapped gently against the shore, washing away footprints and blood alike. The world beyond was uncertain, but we had carved out a small piece of safety, a fragile victory in a relentless world. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could endure.